Welcome. My name is Elizabeth. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm really glad you're here because I have a true crime story for you today. Today's true crime story is also a true story of grit, resilience, and the strength of the human spirit. Today's story is full of twists and turns, and it contains a plot to murder a spouse that, when mishandled, turned into a murder spree, ending the lives of 5 people. But an unlikely hero would emerge. Who would change everything for the perpetrator, who was disguising himself as a victim. Sound complicated? It is, but I will clear the confusion for you. Today's story includes discussion of murder, a large sailboat capsizing in the middle of the ocean, dehydration, malnutrition, extreme exposure, and unaliving. If you're not in the headspace for that right now, no worries, go read a good book. But if you're anything like me, you might want to stick around for the ride. The Duperrault family consisted of Arthur, age 40, his wife Jean, age 38, and their 3 children, Brian, 14, Tere Jo, 11, and Renee, 7. In his earlier years, Arthur spent some time on the ocean between the Bahamas and the coast of Florida. He experienced it as part of his time in the military, and he enjoyed it so much. He thought it was such a beautiful area that he would later start saving up money so that he could take his family to that area to experience the beauty and the wonder. In November of 1961, the family had saved up enough money to rent a sailing vessel, the Bluebelle, for a family vacation. They decided that the harsh winter of Wisconsin could be avoided and that the lifelong dream could be achieved. What a great plan. Spend those cold months on a sailboat between the Florida Keys and the Bahamas and just enjoy themselves. So Arthur hired a captain. His name was Julian Harvey, and his wife Mary, who would cook the meals for the passengers. Now, before we get into the voyage and the subsequent crime, I want to share with you just a little bit of background on Julian Harvey, the man who was hired to be the captain. First of all, Mary was his 6th wife. That's 6. It's the 6th wife. He had divorced most of his ex-wives, but his second wife died in a tragedy. In fact, tragedy seemed to follow Julian wherever he went. Well, tragedies of which he survived and others did not. He had previously survived the 1949 car accident that killed his second wife and her mother when their 1946 Plymouth that he'd been driving, plunged it off a bridge at high speed into a bayou on a rainy night, and he managed to jump out of the vehicle and swim to safety, but he left his wife Joan and her mother Myrtle May to drown. One of Harvey's yawls, the Torbatros, had also previously sunk after running into a submerged wreckage of the warship San Marcos, which had sunk in 1911 in shallow waters within the Chesapeake Bay. Crew members on board repeatedly warned Julian to steer his yawl clear of the wreckage, but he had repeatedly navigated his vessel around the prohibited site, claiming to his cruise passengers he was attempting to read an inscription upon a buoy marking the site. Harvey's powerboat, the Valiant, had also sunk under suspicious circumstances off the coast of Cuba in 1958. All of these losses and tragedies had yielded large insurance settlements, which Julian had been the one who financially benefited. So, a little bit of information for you there. So, back to the Bluebelle. The Duperrault family boarded the Bluebelle at around midday on Wednesday, November 8th, 1961. The family spent the next 4 days traveling from Beamy to Sandy Point, where they snorkeled, and when they were, on land, they purchased souvenirs. At their final port of call, Arthur had stated to Roderick Pinder, who was a British district commissioner, that this has been a once-in-a-lifetime vacation, adding, "We'll be back before Christmas." That evening, the passengers aboard the Bluebelle shared a meal of chicken cacciatore and salad. Shortly thereafter, Tere Jo, the middle one, who was 11, walked below deck to her cabin to sleep as the rest of the family and the Harveys remained on deck. At approximately 12:35 on Monday, November 13th, a crew member aboard the oil tanker Gulf Lion observed a man waving frantically from a dinghy drifting in their direction and shouting. He was shouting, "Help! I have a dead baby on board." What a thing to shout. Pulling the man aboard, crew members observed the deceased body of a red-haired prepubescent girl wearing a life jacket inside the dinghy. Julian misidentified the girl he had with him as Tere Jo, but it was actually Renee, the 7-year-old, their youngest. Julian was welcomed aboard the Gulf Lion, where he was given shoes for his bare feet and a replacement shirt for his salt-sodden one, but he did not accept the gift of replacement pants. Later, crew members would share some interesting things that they had witnessed. One crew member walked by his cabin and saw that there was cash laid out all over his bed. Like all sorts of cash. Like it was like drying out or something. And it was shared that it was shared that he was someone who liked to, or who was known to, sew linings into his pants so that he could hide money. So the reason that he wouldn't take new pants, the reason he refused to give up his pants, was because they were filled with money, right? It was all part of the grift. The crew members also said that he didn't seem like someone who had just gone through a trauma at all. It's very strange. Taken to Nassau, which is in the Bahamas, Julian was questioned by authorities. He said that the previous evening, around 8:30, the Bluebelle was hit by a sudden squall. Now, a squall is a strong, sudden wind that lasts for at least a minute. And he said that this caused the sailboat to keel. Keel is another word for it leaning over. And it says that it leaned over so far that the mast snapped in half. The mast is that main pole that holds up the mainsail. This injured both his wife and Arthur, not critically, but it injured both of them, and also caused a hole in the hull. The hull is like when you get a hole in the hull, that's when your boat sinks. It's bad. You don't want that. Okay, so he says that because of this, the mast breaking and all of the rigging and the sailing falling to the boat, that he was cut off from the other people. And he tried to cut through some of the rigging, which is like the lines, the ropes. And, but as he was trying to do that, he saw that a fire had broken out in the engine. So he just dove overboard and climbed into the dinghy, and says that shortly thereafter he saw Renee floating face down nearby. She was wearing a life jacket. He grabbed the girl and tried to resuscitate her, but to no avail. Now, Julian's calm demeanor and the fact that his dinghy had been filled with various survival supplies caused some authority figures to seriously doubt his claims. But his story could not be disproven, and he was allowed to return to Miami on November 15th to face further inquiry from the Coast Guard. Here's what he did not expect to happen. On November 16th, the Greek freighter Captain Theo's second officer spotted something in the water. He saw what looked like, to him, a small fishing boat about a mile from the Captain Theo. As they got closer, they realized it was not a fishing boat, but a small flotation device that was carrying a small girl. And she's waving at them, feebly, but she's waving at them. The engines of the great freighter were turned off, and the men aboard set to crafting a life raft. The ones that the freighter had on board were too big, and they were worried that it might capsize the girl's small floating device. So they fashioned something from some empty barrels and sent one man down on the raft so that he could lift the girl out of the water. But before they could reach her, they tried to get the message across to her to not jump into the water. You see, sharks, a pod of sharks, were circling her. Before she could be lifted into the lifeboat, one of the men aboard snapped this now famous photo of Tere Jo. Once on board, she weakly identified herself as Tere Jo Dupperault and informed them that she had been floating on that cork float for a few days. It was said she got some water, she may have gotten some orange juice, and then she fell into unconsciousness. Tere Jo was not far from death. Her kidneys had stopped functioning, all the moisture from her body had been redirected to her heart and lungs, and it was starting to take that moisture it needed from her brain. She was moments from full organ failure. It seems they found her just in time to save her life. The cork float that had kept her alive for days was left behind in the water. The Coast Guard would find it a day later, and when they lifted it out of the water, it started to disintegrate in their hands. The news that Tere Jo had been found traveled quickly. On November 17th, while Julian Harvey was being interrogated by authorities, an officer crashed into the room and announced that little Tere Jo had been found, and she had been found alive. Julian exclaimed, "Oh my God!" And then after a beat, said, "Isn't that wonderful?" Then he told the men who were questioning him he was very tired. He needed to contact his wife's family. So they let him go on the promise that he would be returning the next day to continue the interrogation. That night, Julian would check himself into a hotel under an assumed name and he would unalive himself. And it was brutal. When police first saw the scene, they were sure it was a murder that was set up to look like an unalive event. The first cut was to his thigh, and it went all the way to the bone. Officers could not understand how someone could actually do that to themselves. He also had cuts on his ankles and his throat as well. He left a 2-page note which contained zero information about the Bluebelle. But he did ask somebody to please take care of his 14-year-old son, who he was leaving all alone in the world. Okay, so at this point, it's pretty clear that Julian Harvey's account of the sinking of the Bluebelle was fabricated. When she was able to answer questions, her story always stayed the same, even when they asked her questions designed to trip her up, which is what they do to make sure that you're telling the truth. Okay, so Tere Jo finally is able to she recovers enough. It's the first 36 hours are rough. They're not sure she's going to make it, but she does. She's actually incredibly resilient, but 11 years old, the human body is pretty resilient. And here's what she told us. Here's what she experienced that night and the following days. Okay, so she was awoken in her bed by the sound of screaming. She heard her brothers screaming for her father. She jumped out of bed and ran to the deck where she saw both her brother and her mother lying on the deck with a pool of blood surrounding them. When Tere Jo asked Captain Harvey what was going on, he shoved her hard down the stairs and told her to go back into her cabin. She complied, but water was coming in to the cabin. And by the time the mattress she was sitting on started to float from all of the water, she came back up to the main deck. There she asked the captain if the boat was sinking, to which he replied, yes. Then he told her to hang onto a rope that was tied to a dinghy that was already been launched off of the Bluebelle. So the dinghy is in the water, but it's still connected by a rope, and that's what he gave her to hold onto and said, hang onto this. In the terror and confusion of the moment, though, Tere, at the age of 11, lost hold of the rope. And when Julian saw this, he dove into the water and swam for the dinghy. Tere Jo says she never saw him look back. She knew that that was the only life raft, but she remembered that there was a cork float on the front part of the ship tied to the deck. She ran for it and managed to untie it from the Bluebelle, or so she thought. As the sailboat sank, right? So the sailboat is sinking and all the lights are going out because that's what happens. And I can't imagine the level of darkness. And the raft that she's on, the little cork raft she's on, starts to tip because one of the ropes is still connected to the sinking sailboat. She manages to jump in and untie that rope in time. I don't know. Unbelievable. And so at which point Tere was able to climb on top of the float, Now, this little cork float is not meant to be ridden on. They're meant to actually be held onto the people who are in the water. It's like a place for them to hold on to. The cork float was oval, about 5 feet by 2 feet, and there was a lattice work of rope in the middle. So Tere Jo would spend the next 4 nights and 3 days aboard that cork float. On her journey, she would see ships, lights in the distance, and on the third day, she saw the plane that had been sent out to look for survivors of the Bluebelle. But she was wearing white. She was wearing a white top and little pink pedal pushers, they say. And her hair was getting more and more bleached. So her hair was pretty close to white. And the cork float was white. So the fact that she was pretty much just white meant that no plane was ever going to spot her. Because when a plane from above sees something white in the ocean, they think it's whitecaps. No one would ever look at that twice. They just assume it's whitecaps and move on. So even though she saw the plane that was looking for her, they did not see her. A few ships seemed to come close enough for her to paddle to, but when she would try, she would quickly realize that she wasn't getting anywhere and that it really wasn't close enough, and she would stop. During the first day floating, the hot sun beating down on her white shirt and blonde hair, and her skin burned. Searching for a leaf, she would sit in the rope center of the cork float. By sitting in the water, she could save the skin from burning. But while doing so, one of the ropes would break. Many more would break during her time afloat. At one point, she started to feel something nipping at her legs and feet and discovered that she was in the middle of a school of parrotfish, and they were biting her. It was terrifying. She did everything she could to try to protect herself, but when the second night came and the cooling effect on her skin was nice until she found herself close to freezing. She did her best to sit in the water because the water was warmer than the night air. During the second day, she spotted a lighthouse and the lights of passing ships. And that evening, she fell asleep and awoke disoriented. Not remembering she was lost in the sea, she woke with panic. The next morning, she would see the plane looking for survivors. Tere Jo removed her shirt and waved it overhead, but it would not be able to spot her. She would be surrounded by a school of fish so large that it darkened the water around her. Sharks were most likely feeding on the school of fish, but they ignored Tere Jo. Experts say that either the sharks were small, well-fed, or most likely Tere Jo was being protected by a layer of gas and oil. When she had waded through the water on the sinking Bluebelle, she had been coated in this thin layer of gasoline and oil, and so had the cork float. It's said that this oil managed to disguise Tere Jo's smell enough to keep predators from discovering her. Whoa! So her spirits were lifted one day when she saw seagulls flying through the air above her. If there were birds, then there had to be land not far. But no matter how high up she sat or stood or tried to see on her float, she could not spot any land. One of the gulls acted like it was going to land on her float, but she moved and it flew away with a flapping of the wings, which was when Tere Jo noticed large mammals swimming around her. They swam about 20 feet away from her, and she got nervous. Like, with large animals in the water surrounding, that would be scary. What if they're sharks, right? But she noticed that they were using their spouts. They were spitting, doing that air water spit thing. And she realized that it was actually a pod of whales. And at that point, she says she was not afraid. Not at all. In fact, she felt like they were protecting her, that they were swimming with her, and they were taking care of her. Nature's amazing. Whales are amazing. During that night, afloat her cork, she shivered in the cold, but was also suffering from heat stroke. What does that do to your body? The waves that night were between 8 and 13 feet, and somehow she slept until she woke up in the water. She had fallen off of her float, but somehow her arm was wrapped up in the ropes, so she was able to climb back aboard. She didn't lose the float. Tere Jo's experienced visual hallucinations. At one point, she thought she was flying on a plane, even though she'd never been on a plane. She saw her father drinking a glass of red wine, and she wished she could share in this beverage, even though she'd never had red wine. She even saw the typical desert island with one lone palm tree, but when she looked again, it was gone. She slept and dreamt of finding her father on a desert island, only to awaken still floating on the ocean. Her final night, she managed to lay atop the float, even through the 13-foot swells that rocked the ocean surface. She was in and out of consciousness, and when the sun rose on her the final day, as the sea and the sun were so bright on her and just stung her just exhausted eyes, she managed to balance herself on the cork float with her arms out to the side, her head on one of the narrow ends and her legs on the other narrow end. Her body was breaking down, and she had a fever of almost 105. But somehow, she kept atop that tiny cork float. And somehow, between bouts of unconsciousness, she was able to open her eyes and look up, and she saw a great big shadow coming towards her. At first, she thought it was like a great whale or something, but then it solidified in front of her. And she saw that it was a big, dark, great wall with people on the top of it. She could hear faint cries, and she managed to sit up and wave. She got the message that she should be staying where she was on her float. She looked up again and saw 4 great big barrels coming down towards her. Then she felt herself being lifted up. She was placed on the deck, where she promptly fell into unconsciousness. The first 36 hours of her recovery were the most crucial. Could they get her organs functioning again? Could she survive? If so, could she recover? Her aunt and uncle, her father's siblings, were contacted, and they came down to Florida to be with her the whole time she recovered. And recover she did. In fact, by Thanksgiving, she was able to eat a full Thanksgiving dinner with her aunt. She would be raised by her aunt and uncle and her grandfather. Now, remember, this was 1961, a time when therapy was a dirty word and issues were dealt with by being ignored. In other words, they did not deal with it. Tere Jo wouldn't speak of her accident for the next 20 years. Her aunt and uncle talked with the parents of the other kids in her area and told them to make sure that no one ever brought it up. Everyone acted like it just never happened. Later in life, Tere Jo, who changed her name to, is it Tara or Ter? I'm not sure. It's Terry was the original, and she changed it to Tere. I'm not sure if I'm supposed to pronounce that as Tara or not. I'm just going to stick with Terry in case I'm wrong. So later in life, Tere Jo would spend many, many hours working with a therapist, and eventually she and the therapist would pen a book by the name of Alone. Now, this therapist gave her sodium barbital, which is commonly known as truth serum. It's not so much that it makes you tell the truth, but it does make you relaxed enough to access memories that have been buried or forgotten due to trauma. Not all professionals agree with that it actually works that way. And people really don't use it at all anymore. But so Tere Jo, she got married. She had 3 children with her husband, and she has worked and lived her entire life by the water. In 2010, she came out with Alone that she penned with her therapist, and she was interviewed on a famous morning news program. Now, Tere Jo says that if she can save one person with her story, then it's worth telling. Now, this is human resilience. And I'm much happier to focus on Terry than Julian Harvey. He was clearly a jerk. He clearly made this whole thing up. What we did figure out was that his original plan was just to kill his wife, she says. His plan was to go down to the cabin that night, kill her, and then go back up onto the cabin and spend the rest of the night up on the deck, piloting the ship or whatever. And then the next morning, going down and finding her dead and then dealing with it. But someone must have come in and seen what he was doing, or she fought back, or she made noise. Somehow, one of the Duperraults discovered what he was doing, and he had to change his plan and kill everyone and sink the ship. So that's what we think was his plan was. This guy. Did I just growl? This guy is just a piece of work. And I find it so utterly and incredible that 11-year-old Tere Jo Dupperault, Fassbender, that's her married last name, was able to survive those 4 days. You know, humans aren't supposed to survive 4 days without water. Like, it's 3, really. And there were, I read in one of the articles covering this that it did rain the first night, so she may have gotten at least a little bit of hydration on that first night, which may have been what got her to the 4th day. And she became pretty, famous. That photo of the sea orphan, or sea waif, um as she was ended up being called, was very famous and amazing. I mean, it's still to this day, it's an amazing photo. So that is the story of the incredible 11-year-old girl who managed to survive all alone on the ocean for 4 days. Human resilience at its best. Do me a favor. Be nice to yourself. Really, be nice to yourself. You deserve joy and love and happiness. And don't let anyone tell you different. Okay. I'll check you next time. Bye.